I'm allowed to talk shit about my partner.
Yes.
You're not. If you look at kids from families in which their parents were fighting in front of them, they actually fare better after the divorce.
What do you mean? You live with them.
You are not my best friend anymore. On days when we receive and provide support to our partner, that's when our negative mood is lowest. I was in my grandma's arms in the front seat of the car. I turned out fine. I'm not going to drink. And they're like, well, drinking can be fun.
This episode of Primary Care is sponsored by Regiette Health. More than just an ED treatment.
Welcome.
Thanks. I'm Dr. Marci Gleason. I'm a PhD in social psychology, and I'm a professor at UT Austin in the Human Development and Family Sciences Department.
I grew up in a household where there was a lot of arguing, a lot. My stepdad was an alcoholic, which catalyzed for a lot of arguments. My stepdad sometimes would throw things, which would be really shocking for me. And so I still have some trauma with arguing a little bit. And so I really hate it, even though my partner would probably be like, are you sure you hate it? Because I feel like I start it most of the time. Do you ever include much about like whether or not kids are involved with the arguing and how they respond?
Actually, I think this is a great point. I haven't particularly done work on this, but there is plenty of work on it. And parents fighting in front of children is terrible for kids.
Yeah.
It's just not good for them. Now, children seeing parents engage in problem solving, have a disagreement, have an argument, that's okay, right?
Yeah.
But how we want to qualify it, I can't say exactly, but the fighting, if you're yelling at your partner and calling them names and throwing things around your children, it has very negative repercussions for the kids. They see that from very young age, right? Like even babies kind of thing, like having that kind of environment around them, right? And then having that intenseness, the tension that can result when those really big fights haven't been resolved. And most people, when they're in that kind of argument with somebody, can't just turn around and be supportive and kind to their child, right? Exactly. They're snapping at their child. They're like little things that don't normally upset the parent will upset them. So it transfers in that way too, right? So it's not just that the child is seeing it, but a lot of times they're going to be then experiencing some of that anger coming over onto them, even if it doesn't result in emotional or physical abuse to either the partner or the child. Just that is not good for children. Now, if there are parents listening to this and they're like, oh no, no, right?
Right.
It's highly unlikely that this happening on occasion is going to be terrible, but being in a situation in where it's fairly consistent is problematic. And in fact, the research on divorce, what we see is on average, kids of divorce fare less well on some measures, and there's debate about this, right? But academics, social behavioral problems, other things tend to, on average, be higher in kids whose parents have divorced. Yeah. Now, that on average it's such a big deal, right? Because it means that there are plenty of kids of parents who are divorced who are doing better than kids whose parents didn't. You know what I mean? There's so much variability around that, right? But if we're just going to take, the mean. Yeah. But this is completely moderated by whether or not the parents' relationship was highly conflictual and whether that conflict was known to the children. Sure. So if you look at kids from families in which their parents were fighting and fighting in front of them, they actually fare better after the divorce, right? Because the divorce is actually getting them out of that conflict. However, the majority of divorces are not actually in high conflict couples. Right. Most couples aren't that high conflict. I mean, there's a fair number. Don't get me wrong, but but the majority, let's say it's like 60-40 or something, but 60% aren't.
I would say too, my mom, when she got divorced from my stepdad, they were actually at a non-high conflict period of their relationship, which is interesting that you say that because they had so many kind of crazy periods. And so when they decided to, there was a catalyst that was crazy, but they had kind of been in a lull for a minute. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah. And I will say that the research doesn't even get into that kind of complication, right? Of like, so they were conflictual, now they're not. And then
it's a lot of confounding factors.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Is that I study these things and it's so complicated, right? Like human behavior and humans are so much harder to study than, pretty much anything else, right?
Like makes this so great.
It does, but it also means I'm always being like, well, caveat this, and like, well, maybe in this study, and these people say this, but
so you sound like a physician, basically.
I guess. Although I feel like you guys sort of, it's like, I gave you this drug, I didn't give you this drug.
Right,
what happened, right? And it doesn't quite.
True.
It's not quite as simple as that for you either, but yes, for sure. But those families that didn't have a lot of conflict before the divorce, those kids fare worse. And one of the also interesting things about this, and I think that this is one of the really positive things that I'm hoping that this movement for more less conflictual divorce and like cooperation parents, I think we are seeing more of that, right? Where parents are working really hard to not have the divorce negatively impact their kids. Now, the fact is it still often does. The thing is that these lower conflict couples, oftentimes the divorce brings out a lot of conflict, right? So couples, the kids were like, man, my parents are fine, right?
Yeah, right.
And then their parents are getting divorced and they're arguing and fighting and like bringing the kids into it and this kind of, and it can be really, so kids that weren't exposed to that are now, they thought they weren't being exposed to that conflict or being exposed to it in the divorce. And so I think that as there's more attention paid to this, and divorce is, more socially accepted, and people are thinking about it more, and there are more adults who grew up with divorced parents, right? So there's a lot more attention to being paid to the idea of a good divorce. We don't have that data yet. What we have are, largely what I was just talking about, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future with this research as to whether, there's even more sort of nuance that we have to think about and ways that, we can mitigate this and have good outcomes.
When my mom got married to my stepdad, I was 8 years old, and I don't want to sound like it was a horrible experience having him as a stepdad. He was incredible. He helped us achieve life goals. We had I had a great upbringing because of him, especially financially. He paid for me to go to private school where I got a great education. We had a beautiful home with a pool and, so many things that were wonderful. We went on great vacations. We had a good relationship overall. But because I had seen so much of their arguing as I got older, I think when I was like 15 or 16, I realized at that point the relationship wasn't going to last. It was just constant trauma, and it was maybe not all the time. We'd go sometimes a year where everything would be great, but then something big would happen, and then it would be a lot. And so I remember being 16 years old, and I think this actually is when I started to realize how much of a planner I was and how I always was trying to strategize for my own safety and environment. Those things started to really be important to me, and I started to feel as though they could be at risk. So I remember telling my mom, I'm like, you need to buy a condo and tell Eric it's for an investment and that you have it, so when you guys get divorced you have somewhere to go. I was 16. I was already helping her plan this out. We actually went and saw one, and I said, you should tell him that it's for my college, so this is where I'll live. We can use it as an investment home, but this isn't going to work for you. This is horrible what you're doing to yourself, because I'm about to leave. I'm going to turn 18 and I'm gone, and I'll still be with you. I'm not like gone forever, but I'm not even going to get to watch what's going on here, and I'm going to be scared for what's happening. And of course she didn't take my advice, but my advice was right at 16. But I took that with me and really planned for my future. When they ended up getting divorced, that 6 months later, I applied for medical school because I said, I have to support my mom. I have to support myself. I don't know what I'm going to do. I knew I wanted to be in medicine, but I didn't know, how fast I needed to get there. And that was really what catapulted me there, was that trauma. And so there's obviously a lot of negativity that I experienced growing up, but I feel like it also created the person that I am, and I'm really starting to love myself. And so I'm happy that it all happened, but I think we can learn from maybe not having to put kids through that trauma. And there's actually a TV show I've been watching. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before. It's a kids show for really young kids on Disney Channel called Bluey.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it, but my friends who still have really youngins, they love that their kids love it. Their kids love it. They love it.
I'm obsessed. So I don't even have kids, and I actually, it's a Australian produced the production company's from Australia, and so I guess Disney purchased the rights to it in the United States. But it is very good at explaining to other parents how to be a good parent. At least in my perspective. I'm not a parent, so please don't come at me. But one of the things I want to bring it up for is because in one of the episodes, the parents get into an argument and the kids are watching them argue. And then the mom says, I need 20 minutes. And she goes to her room for 20 minutes and closes the door. And so the dad then explains that they had an argument. Sometimes adults have arguments just like you and your brother and sister do. Sometimes we need to take time to breathe, and your mom is having a 20-minute. And so they really normalize this 20-minute session that the mom is having. The neighbor comes over and asks where the mom is, and the kids are like, oh, she can't come out. She's having her 20 minutes. And the neighbor's like, 20 minutes? And then the dad's like, yeah, you know. And then they kind of just normalize that arguing is an important part of a relationship, but it's how you present it to your kids. It's how you explain it to them so that they also know it's normal. They also still feel safe. Mom is gone for 20 minutes, but she'll be right back. Dad's not going anywhere, and it's still a safe home. And I think, and I just watched this like 2 days ago, so it's so random that this is what we're talking about today, but I'm also a big Bluey fan now because I learned a lot of other things.
I might have to like show that clip in my class. So there's this conflict tactic that's known as like demand withdrawal, right? And that there's these patterns in couples in which one person tends to be demanding, right? And the other person, in response to the demand, withdraws, right? And they can withdraw like right in front of you, where they just stop responding, or they can leave, but they basically just won't engage in the discussion in some way. And largely, we see it has negative associations. There's some argument about situations in which it might not. But that is very different from, so people think like, I can't, you know, so if they hear this, there's also, people talk about it as stonewalling, like, you know, just not allowing the conversation to continue. They do tend to be negative patterns. But that isn't what was happening there, right? Because that wasn't, I refuse to talk to you about this, or I'm ignoring you, or I need a break, right? Like, let us come back to this in a little while. Or in a little while, let's decide when we're going to come back to it. But, you know, essentially what that is the adult saying, like, I'm putting myself in timeout, right? And this is actually, so what my understanding, I'm not a parenting expert or a child development expert. Those are my colleagues, but I hang out with them, picked up a few things. And one of my colleagues, you know, said, like, you know, timeout in parenting. Are you familiar with this concept?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I had many of those.
Yeah. And there are effective ways to use it and less effective ways to use it. And a lot of times people think like, oh, it's the punishment, like the kid did something wrong, put the kid in timeout, right? And that's really not what it's supposed to be, right? It's about the idea of, okay, this isn't going the way we want it to be going. We need to do some regulation. We need to have some separation. We need some time. You know, and putting the child in timeout isn't about punishing them for the behavior. It's about removing them from a situation and giving them time to like downregulate, to like, you know,
breathe. Yeah,
to breathe and do these things. And it's really hard, right? Because when you're really mad at your brother or sister, right? Like, you don't want to go sit in your room and think about it or whatever. And honestly, sitting and thinking about it is really not the way to go, right? It's really like, particularly young children, just they need to be removed from the situation and distracted and have a chance to emotionally regulate, and then maybe we can talk about it later, you know, and talk about what went wrong. The idea that, yes, locking your partner out or like walking out and slamming the door or something, that's negative, right? But saying like, I'm overwhelmed, like this argument is not constructive for me, I need to step away from it, is a really reasonable request, right? Now, if they don't come back and engage at some point in time, I think that then, you know, then it's a problem, but you can use it really effectively. And having kids see that model. And also having them do it, right? It's just so valuable. I mean, people do this all the time, right? Like, you know, how many people have written, you know, and you hear people doing this, like angry emails they're never going to send, right? Like, it's just, you just write your angry email and then you know, and then you delete it or you put it in your drafts and you never put the person's address in the place. Don't.
I actually have a new strategy for mine. So I don't know if you've heard of like the AI, OpenAI, where you can like put in and they'll create a document for you. So I'll ask it to create like an angry letter to someone, and then I'll like have them create it, and then I'll have them regenerate it like a few times so I can see it written a few times, and then I know I'm psycho, but I get my point across 2 or 3 times, and I'm like, I didn't send the message. Me and OpenAI had a moment, and I'm ready to move on.
That is amazing. So what I would actually say that what you are doing is that you have taken OpenAI and turned it into a support provider for the kind of support that you want, right? Because what you just described is like, let's say that you and your partner do have an argument that you're still annoyed with, right? Sure. Like that you are hanging on to a little bit, or, maybe not even hanging on to it, but it just does, like, it's going to bug you again, right? And you go out to lunch with your best friend and you complain about your partner, right? Yeah. Like you complain about your partner, you say some things about them, and oftentimes you'll be like, but they're great and I love them and it's fine, because you want your best friend to know that, like, but you get to complain about them. So often after people do this and their best friend is like, oh, it's so annoying, right? Like, how can you stand that? I could not take it. Oftentimes what you'll end up being like, it's not that bad.
Exactly.
Right? Because, like, I'm allowed to talk.
Oh my God.
Are we allowed to swear?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm allowed to talk shit about my partner.
Yes.
You're not. Yeah. So, like, and as a friend, this is a very hard thing to navigate, right?
It's
because, like,
difficult.
Because also, if my best friend is like, that doesn't sound that annoying, I'll be like,
what do you mean? You live with him.
You are not my best friend anymore, right? Like, they're like. And this takes me back to support research, which is that support is incredibly hard to give, right? Because that's the thing. It's like, if I say, oh, that's not annoying, maybe are you sure that you should be mad about this? Like, oh, think about what your partner's perspective or whatever. Like, there are times where you might be receptive to this, but often it is just going to bug you that I am, like, defending your partner. But if I take your side too much, you're going to be like, hey, don't be saying bad things about my partner. So what am I supposed to do? And how is this support supposed to help you? It's really hard. Now, think about your partner. Let's say you're going to your partner and being like, oh, I'm so frustrated by this thing that's happening at, the podcasting studio. I'm sure nothing negative happens here. It's very nice. People here are very nice.
They are.
But, and you come home and you're like, they did blah, 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 right. And your partner's like, I don't know, it sounds like you're kind of in the wrong here. You'd be like, this is not going to go, like, that's not probably what you're looking for your partner to do, right? Or the thing that we all like to do, apparently, is give advice, and your partner's like, this is what you should do. And oftentimes that is not what we want. And there's this stereotype that men do want that. They want direct, practical help. We do not see any evidence of that in the data, right? Neither men or women tend to want advice as their, like, primary source of support from their partner. There are times where we want advice. We tend to ask for it, though. Yeah. What do you advise I do in this situation, right? But when I'm just telling you about something that's driving me crazy, it's probably not what I'm looking for. Right. At the same time, if they are also start sort of like being like, yeah, that place is terrible, you should quit, we'll often be like, well, it's not, like, they're not that, you know what I mean? Like, we do the same thing. Yeah. Well, we're really looking for something that's, like, kind of in the middle, and there's no perfect answer, because we're upset. And really, oftentimes what we're doing is just, we're looking for understanding, and it can be hard for partners to convey that understanding effectively. So I think a lot of times as partners, we just have to think, like, I should just make it clear I'm listening, and that sounds hard.
Yeah,
right?
It's funny you mention that, because I have a few friends that the very little that I hear about their partner is negative, because they're complaining to me because they're venting, which is totally fair. But I have this now negative perception of who their partner is, because that's all I've ever heard. And so it really makes it difficult for me to become friends with their partner, or to even try to relate with their partner. Sometimes I don't even trust their partner because of the things that I've heard. And it's difficult for me too, because I can think of a very specific incident where I'm like, I want to tell this person, I don't want you to talk to me about your partner anymore, because I can't help you. Like, I don't know, and it's hurting me. It's actually, as a friend, you're making it harder on me to be your friend. And I'm sure there's people out there that can relate to that, especially, most of us like to vent to our friends, and most of us are the actors and leads in our own lives, and so we have a lot to say, and you want your friend to be there for you. But I struggle with being there for people when they talk about their relationship, and which is why I usually never talk about mine with other people. So OpenAI is very helpful. Yeah. Hey folks, my podcast Primary Care is sponsored by Rougiette Ready, the latest pharmaceutical advancement in erectile dysfunction. This is a sublingual compounded treatment using 3 ingredients, sildenafil, tadalafil, and apomorphine, and it works up to 5 times faster than pills and chewables. We give you a promo code Primary Care for 20% off your first order and free shipping. Now, let's get back to the content.
All right, so there's a couple of things. I want one to go back to what I was saying about social support research, way back. So when I was saying that, like, they've found all of this positivity around being somebody socially supported. But when we actually look at instances of social support, we often find that it's not linked to positive mood. If I say at the end of the day that, like, my partner gave me emotional support, I will often report worse mood on that day than I do on a day when I don't report that, even if I'm indicating the same level of stressors. And we've done this there's been some experimental work on this. So it seems like social support at the time it's given is not nearly as effective as it is like kind of a global idea.
Gotcha.
Right? And I think part of this is that, like, what we're just talking about, like, it's really hard to receive that support and for it to be the support we're looking for and for it to be effective.
Right.
Particularly at that moment when we're upset, right? But then maybe later we can kind of come back to what somebody said, what our partner recommended, and that we're more able to take that information in when we're not actually upset about it. And it's good that we have it, right? Because also, if we don't talk to our partner about it when we're upset, there's a good chance we'll never talk to them about it, and then we just become disconnected, right? Like, telling our partners about what's upsetting us in our lives, or what we're struggling with, or what venting to our partner, these are bonding things. And what we actually do see is that you might not feel less anxious, but you report more relationship satisfaction when it's in an experiment and it's a stranger doing it. You like the stranger more. So even though the stranger just made you more anxious, you like them more than if they didn't make you more anxious, right? Sure. Because showing that you care and, like, being engaged with people is so important. And that's those social bonds. And that's really what I think those global social support measures are getting at, right? Like, do I have people who will be there for me?
Exactly.
Even if sometimes being there for me is annoying, right? Like, they're being annoying. But, like, down the road, I will probably be able to accept that more. Yes. And certainly, I think as support providers, we can all work on being better at providing it.
Exactly.
But, there is this sort of double-edged sword to support vision. My work in particular, actually, though, shows that one way to kind of make social support more palatable to the person receiving it is if both people are venting and getting and receiving social support, if we have an exchange of social support, that tends to be more beneficial, right? And I think it also, like, if you're venting about your partner and your friend is venting about your partner, it's easier for you to be like, oh, I know they don't, like, their partner's not bad, just like my partner's not bad.
Exactly.
And, like, it can help with that kind of thing too, right? I see this in my data that on days when we receive and provide support to our partner, that's when our negative mood is lowest. And so there really seems to be something beneficial about, like, an exchange of support. Now, what I don't know, and I would say in the way that I study this, is I don't know that that's happening in the same conversation or anything like that. But I think it's just the idea of, like, hey, we're doing this together, right? Like, we're both finding each other useful in this discussion and helping each other through it, and it bonds us. Like, we are social creatures. We have always lived in groups, right? The worst thing that can happen to a person is to be kicked out of the group, whether it be a group of two or a group of many, right? We are generally, people are very, very afraid of rejection, and rejection really hurts and is really upsetting, right?
Yeah.
So it's really great to feel needed, right? And so we tend to really like giving support, right? People are, particularly Americans, I think, but in general, I think it goes beyond America, are often hesitant to ask for help because we don't want to be a burden to people. And certainly if you're always asking for help and you're not changing anything, and it sounds to me kind of in this situation that your friend is kind of coming to you and talking about their partner, and they're always in that place and they're not doing anything to change it. And it's like a bottomless void or something. It's like you're pouring care and understanding into something and there's no bottom, right? Like it's just more care that you have to get. And that is not great, right? Like, that is not a great situation, but and that's not good for the caregiver. But in general, we like to give support, right? Like, it means that our friends and our partners and our family members value us and need us, and they're not going to kick us out, right? We have value in this group. They need me. Therefore, I get to stay and be in my group, and that's just incredibly important, I think, to us as people. And then having that safety net that, oh, I have somebody who will be there for me when I'm struggling, that idea that when I know that support's available to me, how beneficial that is. I just think it's, again, it's like, oh, I can go out and explore the world. I can do these things. I feel confident that somebody's going to be there for me when I do it. And that, I think, is, it's the other side of the coin. It's just that the actual instances of them being there are kind of hard. The example I give to my students all the time is like, it's great to know that if things don't work out after college, you could move into your parents' basement. It's less great to do it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Now, there's the complicating factor of like things aren't working out well,
yes,
right?
Yes.
But also, it's like we want to know the safety net is there.
Exactly.
We don't want to necessarily have to activate the safety net, right? Particularly in big things.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think I am a huge safety net person. I try to have safety nets behind my safety nets, above my safety nets, below my safety nets. I think that too comes from just a little bit of the trauma that I experienced growing up in a kind of a traumatic household. But again, I hate saying that because I think my mom did an excellent job raising me, and she found a partner who she really loved and supported and was like, you know, ride or die. She was by his side. And so there's so much to say and to appreciate with that. And she really wanted to help him through his alcoholism. And sometimes, you know, those things just don't go according to plan. So I hate referring to my childhood as bad in any way, because it was not. But it did just sort of make me feel like I needed to be prepared. And even now, you know, unfortunately, after my parents my mom and stepdad got divorced, they had to sell all the home, they had to sell all of their things, and there was really no money left. And so, you know, I became kind of the breadwinner for my mom, which she was always my safety net. I always knew that ultimately she would have my back, and she does in many ways, just not financially anymore. That's my job now. And so it's just weird. Even now at, you know, almost 33 years old, I always grew up feeling like I could make a mistake and have a place to live and have a shelter, but now I am that shelter. So it's interesting how things can change as we get older, you know, and some of those safety nets get moved around, but it also helps you, I think, become a bit stronger and kind of deal with things a little bit differently.
Yes, I think that that's very true. And I think that you are experiencing something that is really hard at 16 and even as a young adult, which is, you know, in some ways acting as a parent to your parent,
sure.
Which a lot of us do as we age and our parents age, right? Like, but it's not necessarily common to be doing it at the age that you were doing it. And that is traumatic and difficult.
Yeah.
But I also want to say that, like, yes, what you're saying about, like, my mom was amazing and I had a great childhood in many ways. In the same way that when we want to vent about our partners or talk about how they're terrible, it's like nothing is one thing or, like, very few situations are all one thing or all another.
Exactly.
And we are the sum of our our past, and there's going to be good and bad there. And, you know, and you can have kids who grow up in the same household and have very different experiences of it and very different outcomes from it. So, like, so much of it isn't that predictable. But one of the things that you were saying that just also reminds me of one of the things I try to do with my class is a lot of parents in the United States, the majority use corporal punishment or, you know, physical punishment of their kids. And all of the research suggests that this is ineffective. Right. Not only ineffective in stopping the behavior, but really detrimental for the kid's relationship with their parents, can increase bad behaviors. Like, there's really no evidence that inflicting pain on children is a good way to change behavior,
right,
or cultivate your relationship with them.
Right.
But a lot of people grew up being spanked, and they love their parents.
Yeah.
And they're great people. So when I tell them, like, oh, spanking's related to these negative outcomes, they're like, well, I was spanked and I turned out fine. And I'm like, yeah, you did. You're amazing. You turned out great, right? But, like, it's not even that I think that them not spanking you would have turned out better. It's like, it's this population level thing, right? Like, it's across the population. If we weren't doing it, we think on average, like, there's a lot of evidence that people would have better outcomes from that. And one of the things and they're very hesitant to condemn, like, not that I'm asking them to, like, take a pledge, but they're very hesitant to want to change and not do corporal punishment themselves, right? Like, they're like, well, you know, I know that it worked for me. I turned out okay, so I'm going to do the same with my kids. And I will say I'm seeing this a lot less in my undergraduates, even 10 years later. But what I point out to them is, like, my parents brought me home from the hospital. I was in my grandma's arms in the front seat of the car, right? No one would do that now.
Right.
Like, I turned out fine.
Exactly.
Right? But, like, what were they thinking right now? I mean, and that's the same thing. I really mean it, right? Like, we thought as a society, and many parts of our society still do believe, that the way to get children to behave is to spank them. And so that's what you do, right? Like, but when we get information that maybe that's not great, we can change without condemning what people did in the past, right? And condemning what our parents did in the past. And also just thinking of our parents as like complicated people, right? Just like we are complicated people. And I am sure you have done things in your relationship with your partner, with your mother, with your friends that you aren't proud of, right?
Absolutely.
But that doesn't mean you're a bad partner or a bad son or a bad friend, right? It means like,
I'm human.
Yes, we all, and it's the problem is when you are unable to recognize it and you don't make efforts not to do it, but we're all gonna do it. We all have sort of both of those things. Like we're not infallible. And so I just feel like, when we talk about our childhoods, we're often talking about things, oftentimes things that weren't great come up because oftentimes they're the things that we kind of remember really clearly, but they're not condemnations of the entire thing, we turn out just fine.
Yeah.
On average.
I think it's good to have that dialogue though. And I think we are coming to this point where we're more aware that people and people, including myself, I cling on to things that sometimes are from the past or from my family's heritage or what we just do. And I question them now, like, maybe that's not the best option. Maybe it's not great to drive in the front car with the baby, but in the South, that's what we do. It's just common, and maybe some of these things, yes, we turn out fine, but we could do better. And because we don't need to think of ourselves as the individual, we need to think of ourselves as the herd. And if we make this rule or make these decisions for the herd, overall, the population is going to do better. And maybe trying to take a step back from our individual minds occasionally is what I try to do, and what I try to promote is that we are a country, we're a world, we're a global civilization trying to progress. Like, let's work as a unit, let's think as a unit. We don't always have to be a me. It's something I struggle with though, I think we all do.
Yes, it's so hard. It's such a balance, right? Everything's such a balance. Because as soon as I was thinking about that, I went back to also thinking about, how we were talking about how like anything can go too far in one direction, right?
For sure.
So then I also think about like how parenting today, like all of these things that were like, you can't do this, you can't do that, it's too risky, it's blah, blah, and it's like, whoa, clearly there are areas in which we've taken this way too far, right? And we're like, oh yeah, your kid needs to be in a car seat, right? Like car seats are good and we should have people use them, they should use them most of the time. That seems reasonable. But to the idea of like, children up to the age of 13 can't walk down the street by themselves in their neighborhood. And it's crazy. Like, okay, that seems, that is... You're right. Something could happen to them as they walk down the street. Like, again, it's all this like risk thing, right? But we want, I think, it's just hard because like we want everybody to be, like we want it to be okay. We want to reduce risk wherever we can, and we hear about it and we're like, no, don't do that. And then people just end up stuck in a place where it's like, I can't do all these things that people want me, like, are telling me I need to do.
For me, the most beautiful part of humanity is that sometimes we're okay and sometimes we're not okay. And you have to have those not okay moments to develop, whether you're 2 years old, whether you're 5 years old, 8 years old, 12, 15, 18, you have to have risks in your life somewhere because that's how you mature. And so I do look at kids now. I think there was some literature that's been posted that kids are getting less interested in driving themselves around. There's less kids applying for driver's license. When I was 15, I was the first person in the line on my birthday at 15 to get my learner's permit because that meant 1 year later I would get my license. And when I got my license, it was, I'm an adult now. That's all I wanted as a kid, is just that freedom. But I didn't have any fear of the big world around me. I didn't have social media or the news constantly telling me how scary everything was. It was probably just as scary as it is today. There's different variables there, of course, but I turned out fine, and most people my age turned out fine. So it's hard because, like you mentioned, we want to keep our kids safe. We want to keep everyone in our community safe, but are we keeping them safe by protecting them from every little thing, and that's...
Yeah, and it's all just it's risk and reward and and finding the right balance. And I think it's and the other thing is every kid is different, right?
Yes.
So it's like you've got my brother is like a risk seeker and and I am the exact opposite. and my parents, I think I have very excellent parents, would really approach it differently, where they would try to pull back my brother a little bit, and they would kind of like push me, right? Because I'd be like, I'm not going to drink. And they're like, well, drinking can be fun.
I love your parents, first of all. It's very real. That's a great conversation to have, because there can be two sides, and not everyone needs to hear drinking can be fun, but there are people who do need to hear
My brother figured it out on his own.
Exactly. So he's good.
And they were, it can be too, they can go bad places. Like, let's pull back there. But me, they were like, yeah, maybe be less rigid, maybe,
Different kids, different strategies.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also like different people, different strategies, right? And even different times in our own lives, different strategies, and But being able to connect with people, I think, is just one of the most important things we can do. But also understanding that like we're all going to make mistakes while we're doing it, because it's hard. Like, it's actually complicated. And even if I ask you what you want, you're probably not going to necessarily really know the answer.
Yeah, that's true. I think this was certainly one of the most fun topics, and I'm serious. This was incredible. I would love to have you back.
Well,
and I feel like we have plenty to touch on.
Clearly, I have no problem talking.
Same. So we're a match made in heaven. But so thankful for you for coming, and I look forward to your return.
Great. Well, it was very nice to meet you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Add us on Instagram at Primary Care Pod. Catch up on past episodes and don't miss out on new ones. Subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify at Primary Care Pod.